It was a brisk autumn evening in Hampton Falls, a quiet, coastal town in New England. The fading sunlight cast long shadows over the quaint streets as the leaves danced in the breeze, a vivid reminder that change was in the air. The Dawson family had lived here for generations, their roots deep in the town's soil. On the outside, everything seemed perfect. A picturesque family, an idyllic home by the sea, everything everyone else aspired to. Cassandra Dawson stood at the window of her sprawling, two-story home, gazing out over the ocean. The waves crashed softly against the rocks below, their steady rhythm a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in her mind. She was the epitome of grace and poise, always the center of attention in Hampton Falls. People admired her for her beauty, her intelligence, her perfect marriage to Dominic Blake, a rising star in the world of architecture. But deep down, Cassandra felt a growing unease, a sense of suffocation that she couldn't shake. She had sacrificed so much to create this perfect life. Her dreams of travel, adventure, and freedom had been set aside for a family, a home, and a husband. And while Dominic loved her, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was missing. The man who once swept her off her feet with his passion had become distant. His eyes, once filled with admiration, now seemed to look past her, lost in the endless whirlwind of work and societal expectations. Their love, once vibrant, now felt like a memory, fading with each passing day. But then, there was Jessica, her younger sister. A force of nature, a whirlwind of chaos and rebellion. Where Cassandra was calm and composed, Jessica was impulsive and unpredictable. The two had always been worlds apart. Jessica had been the one to challenge authority, to push boundaries, to rebel against everything their family expected of them. She was the one who never seemed to fit in, the one who couldn't live up to the perfect image their parents had created for their family. Jessica had disappeared years ago, leaving behind a trail of broken relationships and unanswered questions. But now, she was back. When Cassandra first heard Jessica was returning to Hampton Falls, she hadn't known how to feel. Part of her was thrilled at the prospect of reconnecting with her sister, to relive their childhood memories and perhaps heal the old wounds that had festered over the years. But another part of her, a quieter, more instinctual part, felt a growing sense of dread. She knew Jessica's return wasn't just about family, it was something more. Something unsettling. Dominic hadn't said much about it, of course. He was always the ever-dutiful husband, never one to stir the pot. But Cassandra could tell that the return of Jessica was already having an effect on him. She saw the subtle changes, how he would look at Jessica a little too long when she laughed, how he would find excuses to spend more time at the office or go on business trips. The air between the three of them had shifted, thickening with tension. The first night Jessica returned, the three of them gathered for dinner at Cassandra and Dominic's home. The laughter was forced, the conversation stilted. Jessica had always had a knack for making things uncomfortable, and this night was no different. As she leaned across the table, her voice a little too sweet, her eyes a little too bright, Cassandra couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through her fingers. Something about Jessica had changed, and Cassandra could feel it, like a shadow creeping into her perfect life, threatening to tear everything apart. Dominic, ever the dutiful husband, smiled politely. He was, as always, the charming architect, the man everyone admired. But Cassandra couldn't help but notice how, as the evening wore on, his attention seemed to drift, landing a little too often on Jessica. The sister she once adored, the one she had grown up with, was now the source of a strange and unsettling attraction. It was a simple touch. A fleeting glance. But in the air between them, it felt like the crack of a thunderstorm waiting to break. And so, the stage was set. The cracks in the perfect image of their life were beginning to show. And neither Cassandra nor Dominic could see what was coming. As the days passed in Hampton Falls, the once serene rhythm of Cassandra's life began to falter. Her mind, usually calm and methodical, was now consumed with thoughts of Jessica. It wasn't just the return of her younger sister that troubled her, it was the subtle shifts in Dominic's behavior, the way his eyes lingered on Jessica just a little too long. It was the way the two of them would exchange looks when they thought she wasn't paying attention. A spark of something unspoken, something that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface. Cassandra, ever the dutiful wife, tried to push the nagging thoughts aside. She convinced herself she was just being paranoid, overthinking as she so often did. But there was no denying the tension. It hung in the air like an uninvited guest, suffocating the warmth that had once existed between them. Dominic had always been her rock. The man she had fallen in love with all those years ago had been driven, passionate, and completely devoted to her. They had shared dreams, hopes, and plans for a future together. But now, as the days turned into weeks, Cassandra felt that drive slipping away from him. The passion in his eyes had dimmed, replaced with an exhaustion she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the work. No, she knew that Dominic had always thrown himself into his career, but something had changed. He was no longer the man who used to come home after a long day, eager to share the details of his projects and his life. Now, he came home distracted, distant. The smile he gave her seemed forced, as though he was going through the motions, playing a part in a life that no longer felt real. Cassandra tried to fill the emptiness. She planned romantic dinners, weekend getaways, and family gatherings, anything to reignite the spark. But Dominic's responses were half-hearted at best. He would go along with the plans, but his mind was elsewhere. She caught him staring out the window during one of their dinners, his gaze fixed on nothing, as though lost in thought. It was then that Cassandra began to notice the little things. The way he'd sometimes forget to tell her when he was staying late at the office. The way he'd come home late from a business trip, his suit a little too rumpled, his scent slightly off. The small but growing cracks in the foundation of their marriage. But what unsettled her most were the moments she caught Dominic looking at Jessica. At first, she told herself it was nothing. After all, they hadn't seen each other in years, and it was only natural that there would be some sense of familiarity between them. But the way his eyes softened when Jessica spoke, the way he leaned in to listen to her, made Cassandra feel like a stranger in her own home. It wasn't that she was jealous. She had never been the jealous type. But something about the way Dominic and Jessica interacted sent a cold shiver down her spine. It was subtle, nothing overt, nothing that anyone else would notice, but to Cassandra, it was undeniable. It felt like an invisible thread connecting them, a thread she was powerless to cut. Jessica, for her part, was like a storm. She had always been the more unpredictable of the two sisters, the one who couldn't stay in one place for too long. Her return to Hampton Falls had been sudden, and Cassandra wasn't sure what to make of it. Jessica had always been the one who resisted the expectations of their family, the one who chose a different path. And now, she seemed determined to upend the life that Cassandra had worked so hard to build. At first, Cassandra had welcomed her sister back with open arms. After all, they were family. They shared a history, a bond that no one could break. But as time passed, Cassandra began to feel the weight of Jessica's presence in her home. The laughter, the casual touches, the way she would steal Dominic's attention with her wild stories and spontaneous charm, it was all too much. It wasn't just that Jessica was different from her, it was that she was everything Cassandra was not. Where Cassandra was steady and dependable, Jessica was chaotic and impulsive. Where Cassandra had built a life that fit into the mold of perfection, Jessica had created a life that was anything but. And that, more than anything, made Cassandra feel small, insignificant. Jessica was everything she had once wanted to be, a free spirit, unburdened by the weight of responsibility, someone who could live without the constraints of a perfect image. And Cassandra? Well, she had given up that freedom long ago. She had traded it for stability, for the life that everyone expected her to live. And now, as she watched Jessica slip back into the role of the family prodigal daughter, she couldn't help but feel a surge of resentment. Her resentment was like a slow burn, building with every passing day. But it wasn't just resentment that she felt, it was fear. Fear that Jessica would take everything she had worked for. Fear that Dominic, the man she had loved for so long, would find in her sister something she no longer could give him. The more she watched them together, the more she realized that her fears weren't unfounded. There was something between them, something that neither of them was willing to admit, but it was there, lingering in every glance, in every shared moment. Cassandra could feel it, deep in her gut. It wasn't long before she began to question everything. What had happened to the man she married? Where had the man who once adored her gone? And how had Jessica, the sister who had always been a thorn in her side, managed to weave herself into their lives so seamlessly? The tension between them grew palpable. The love Cassandra had once shared with Dominic was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. And Jessica? She was only just getting started. The walls of Hampton Falls had always seemed like a fortress, a place where families like the Dawsons could retreat from the world. The house, perched on the edge of a rocky cliff, was beautiful in its simplicity, a reflection of the perfect life Cassandra and Dominic had worked so hard to create. But now, as the days stretched into weeks, the very walls that had once offered comfort seemed to close in around Dominic, suffocating him with expectations he could no longer meet. Dominic Blake had always been driven, a man who built his life with a single-minded purpose. He had risen through the ranks of the architectural world with impressive speed, his talent and determination earning him accolades and respect. He had married Cassandra, the perfect woman for him, beautiful, kind, and everything he had ever wanted in a partner. Together, they had built a life that was the envy of Hampton Falls. Yet, somewhere along the way, something had begun to unravel. At first, Dominic had chalked it up to the stress of his career. The pressure of managing high-profile projects in Boston, the constant travel, and the never-ending stream of deadlines had worn him down. But lately, it wasn't just work that had begun to weigh on him. It was the suffocating perfection of his marriage, the unspoken expectation to always be the perfect husband, the perfect man. The reality of his life, of his marriage to Cassandra, had begun to feel like a performance, one in which he no longer recognized himself. The cracks had started to form in the quiet moments. The evening spent at home with Cassandra had grown colder. What was once filled with warmth and laughter was now a silent routine, a series of well-rehearsed actions with no real connection. Cassandra would smile, ask about his day, and he would answer, his voice devoid of the passion it once carried. Their conversations had become formal, polite exchanges about the weather, the house, the town, anything but the things that had once mattered to them both. It wasn't that Dominic didn't love Cassandra. He did, with all his heart. But there was something missing, something he couldn't explain. The passion, the fire they had once shared, had slowly faded into the background, drowned out by the weight of expectation. It wasn't just the work that pulled him away, it was the unspoken pressure to maintain the facade of a perfect life. When Jessica returned to Hampton Falls, it was like a breath of fresh air in a room that had become stale. She was wild, untamed, and unpredictable. Where Cassandra was calm and composed, Jessica was a whirlwind, a force of nature that Dominic couldn't help but be drawn to. Her return had stirred something in him, something long buried beneath the surface. He found himself looking at her differently. She wasn't the same girl he had once known, the little sister of his wife, always overshadowed by Cassandra's perfection. No, Jessica had changed. She was older now, more confident, more alluring. Her energy was contagious, and for the first time in years, Dominic felt alive. She didn't need him to be perfect. She didn't expect him to be the perfect husband or the perfect man. She simply wanted him to be himself. At first, he resisted. He tried to ignore the subtle spark between them, the tension that simmered just beneath the surface whenever they were alone. But the more he saw of Jessica, the more he found himself caught in her web. She was everything Cassandra no longer was, the excitement he had longed for, the freedom he had forgotten how to enjoy. She listened to him in a way that felt genuine, not out of obligation or routine. She asked questions that made him think, that made him feel seen. The guilt started to eat at him. He loved Cassandra, or at least he had. But in those moments with Jessica, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, something raw, something real. The lines between right and wrong began to blur. Dominic started making excuses. More late nights at the office, more business trips to Boston, more time spent away from home. It wasn't that he wanted to be away from Cassandra, but being with her had begun to feel like a chore, a weight he could no longer carry. Jessica, on the other hand, seemed to revel in the attention. She was fully aware of the effect she had on him, the way his eyes would linger on her a little too long when she laughed or how his voice would soften when they spoke. She didn't push him, didn't demand anything from him. Instead, she played the role of the confidant, the friend he never knew he needed. And in doing so, she slowly began to worm her way into his heart, a heart that had once belonged to Cassandra. As the weeks wore on, Dominic's internal struggle grew. His marriage was unraveling, not because of anything Cassandra had done, but because of his own choices. He was falling deeper into a relationship that was built on lies and secrecy. And yet, every time he looked at Jessica, he felt a surge of desire, of need, things he hadn't felt in so long. The guilt was overwhelming. He would come home to Cassandra and pretend everything was fine, but it wasn't. He couldn't look her in the eye without feeling a stab of remorse, without wondering how long he could keep the truth hidden from her. He couldn't help but feel trapped, caught between the woman he had promised to love forever and the woman who made him feel like he could finally breathe again. He had always been the one to hold everything together, to make sure everything was perfect. But now, he was starting to crumble beneath the weight of his own choices. The man who had built a life based on stability, order, and perfection was now lost in a mess of lies and emotions he couldn't control. And the longer this went on, the harder it would be to ever put the pieces of his life back together. Every time he saw Cassandra smile, it felt like a reminder of everything he was about to lose. Every time he caught a glimpse of Jessica, it was a reminder of everything he thought he needed. Dominic Blake, the man who had it all, was now drowning in a sea of his own making. And the storm that was brewing, one of guilt, betrayal, and irreversible choices, was about to engulf him. As the weeks passed, it became clear, Dominic wasn't just caught between two women, he was trapped in the very life he had built. And no matter how hard he tried to escape, the weight of his choices would pull him back down, deeper and deeper into the darkness. The perfect image of his life was slowly, but surely, unraveling. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The town of Hampton Falls was no stranger to change, but there was something about the return of Jessica Dawson that felt different, like a storm on the horizon, one that threatened to disrupt everything in its path. For years, Jessica had been the one to rebel, to challenge everything their family stood for, and when she left, it seemed like the final chapter in a story that had been written for her. But now, like a wave crashing against the shore, she had returned to the town that had once shaped her. And with her return, the balance that had once held Cassandra and Dominic's world together began to crack. It had been over 5 years since Jessica had left Hampton Falls, and in that time, the town had moved on without her. The Dawson family, once known for their picture-perfect image, had quietly slipped into the background of the town's everyday life. But when Jessica walked back into town, it was as though a door had been flung wide open, and all the long-buried emotions, old grudges, and forgotten desires came rushing back. Cassandra was initially thrilled to see her sister again. Family, after all, was family. The years apart had left a void, one that Cassandra had never fully acknowledged. She wanted to believe that things could go back to the way they once were, when they were children, when they shared everything, when their bond was unbreakable. And for the first few days, it felt like she had gotten her sister back. They spent hours talking about their childhood, reminiscing about the days before adulthood had complicated everything. Jessica, ever the life of the party, had no trouble slipping back into their old dynamic. She had an ease about her, a natural charm that made everyone gravitate toward her. But as the days passed, something changed. A subtle shift. Cassandra began to notice the way Dominic looked at Jessica when they were all together, how his eyes lingered on her just a bit too long when she laughed, how his attention seemed to always drift toward her, even in the middle of a conversation. At first, she brushed it off. After all, it had been years since Jessica had come home. Maybe Dominic was simply caught up in the novelty of her return. But the longer she observed, the more she realized that there was something unspoken between them, a tension, an attraction, that neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge. Jessica, of course, played it all off with a smile. She was the perfect guest, the perfect sister-in-law, the perfect charmer. She had no intention of causing any trouble. But she was well aware of the power she held, the way her presence seemed to shift the air in the room, the way it made Dominic restless in a way he hadn't been in years. She was never overt in her actions, but there was an undeniable magnetism about her. It was as though she knew exactly how to make Dominic feel seen, heard, and understood in a way that Cassandra no longer could. For Dominic, the attraction was subtle at first. It wasn't that he had fallen out of love with Cassandra, he still loved her, in a way. But there was a restlessness inside him, a craving for something more. His marriage to Cassandra, once filled with passion and excitement, had become a routine. The thrill had faded, replaced by the comfort of familiarity. And when Jessica came back into his life, it was like a spark had been reignited. She was wild, spontaneous, and full of energy. She was everything Cassandra had once been, free-spirited and unafraid to take risks. Dominic found himself drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain, and the more he tried to resist, the harder it became to ignore the pull between them. When Jessica smiled at him, it was like a rush of warmth spread through his chest. When she laughed, he couldn't help but feel lighter, as though she were the breath of fresh air he had been craving. Jessica was clever. She didn't need to seduce him outright, her charm was enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about his marriage, about his life. She would lean in just a little too close, her scent intoxicating, her words always so carefully chosen. She listened to him in a way that felt genuine, something Cassandra, despite her love for him, had stopped doing. She asked him about his work, about his dreams, about the things that made him feel alive, questions that no one had asked him in years. With each conversation, each stolen moment, Dominic found himself slipping deeper into a world he hadn't realized he'd been missing. And yet, he fought it. He fought it because he knew how wrong it was. He loved Cassandra. He had promised to spend his life with her. But there was something about Jessica, something undeniable, something that made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. The more time he spent around her, the harder it became to ignore the pull between them. It was intoxicating, thrilling, and it scared him. Cassandra, meanwhile, couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She noticed the subtle shifts in Dominic's behavior, the way he would disappear into his office for hours, the late-night phone calls, the way he would always make excuses to be away. And when they were together, there was a distance between them, an emotional gap that had begun to widen. She tried to fill it with the things she thought would bring them closer, dinners, weekends away, tender words. But nothing seemed to work. Her insecurities, which had once been buried deep, began to resurface. Was Dominic losing interest in her? Was their marriage a facade, held together by the expectation of perfection? Or was it something deeper, something she couldn't even put into words? The realization hit her like a slap to the face. She was losing him. Slowly, but surely, the man she had built her life with was slipping away, and the one thing she feared most was becoming a reality. Jessica had come back and unwittingly become the catalyst for a shift she couldn't control. The tension between the three of them had reached a breaking point. Dominic's internal conflict was tearing him apart, and Cassandra's suspicions were starting to bubble to the surface. But none of them were ready to confront the truth, not yet. The quiet storm had begun, and none of them knew that it would soon explode, shattering everything they had once believed to be true. Jessica's return had changed everything. And in doing so, she had set in motion a series of events that no one, not even she, could predict. The tension in Hampton Falls was now thick enough to cut through with a knife. It wasn't just the town that had changed. The very fabric of the Dawson family had been torn apart by the quiet, insidious affair between Jessica Dawson and Dominic Blake. What had started as a subtle shift, an unspoken connection, a lingering glance, was now an undeniable force. The perfect life they had all tried so desperately to maintain was slipping through their fingers, unraveling piece by piece. Jessica knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't a naive girl anymore. She had grown into a woman who understood the power of her presence, her allure. When she returned to Hampton Falls, she hadn't come just to reconnect with family, she had come to reclaim something she felt she had lost. The perfection that Cassandra seemed to effortlessly embody was something Jessica had always struggled to attain. But now, in the shadows of Cassandra's marriage to Dominic, she saw an opportunity to prove her own worth, to finally step out from her sister's shadow and take what had always been just out of reach. At first, the affair between Jessica and Dominic was nothing more than a dangerous flirtation, a game they both played carefully. Their stolen glances became longer, the touches more deliberate. It wasn't anything overt. It didn't need to be. Jessica wasn't trying to force him into anything, instead, she merely wanted him to fall into her orbit. She used her charm, her wit, and her understanding of Dominic's unspoken desires. She knew the cracks in his marriage, knew how to exploit them without ever pushing him too far. She was patient, letting the chemistry between them build until it could no longer be denied. For Dominic, it was like stepping into a world he hadn't even realized he had been craving. His marriage to Cassandra had always been built on stability, on the illusion of perfection. But it had become suffocating. Cassandra, as much as he loved her, no longer seemed to understand him. The woman who had once been his greatest support had slowly turned into a reminder of the perfect image he could never fully live up to. And then there was Jessica. She was the opposite of everything he had known. She was spontaneous, free-spirited, and unburdened by the weight of expectations. With her, he could be someone else, someone less confined by the roles he had been playing for years. He didn't have to be the perfect husband, the perfect man. With Jessica, he could be himself, or at least a version of himself he had long forgotten. Their first kiss had been accidental, at least, that's what Dominic told himself. It happened one evening after Cassandra had gone to bed. Dominic had been in the kitchen, pouring himself a drink, trying to shake off the feeling of inadequacy that seemed to follow him everywhere lately. Jessica had entered the room to ask him about something trivial, a question about a family event or some other insignificant detail. But when she smiled, something shifted. He saw the way her eyes softened, the way her lips parted slightly, inviting him in. It was only a split second, but in that moment, Dominic knew something had changed. She leaned in just a little too close, and without thinking, he kissed her. At first, it was soft, hesitant, as though both of them were testing the waters. But soon, the kiss deepened, the tension between them becoming more palpable, more urgent. The guilt surged through Dominic, but it was drowned out by something else, desire. In that fleeting moment, everything else faded away. There was no perfect image of a husband, no ideal life. There was only the rawness of the connection they shared. The affair didn't stay a secret for long. Once it had begun, it consumed them both. They would steal moments whenever they could, during Cassandra's long hours at work, late at night when everyone else was asleep, or even during the occasional weekend away when Dominic was supposedly working. They told themselves it was just a brief escape, something to fill the emptiness that had grown between Dominic and Cassandra. But the more time they spent together, the more dangerous their secret became. Dominic fought against it at first. He told himself he wasn't like this, that he loved Cassandra, that he couldn't betray her. But with Jessica, it was as though the walls he had built up around himself began to crumble. She made him feel wanted again, something he hadn't felt in so long. Each stolen kiss, each secret rendezvous, pulled him deeper into a web of lies and deceit. Jessica, on the other hand, was more than willing to indulge in the affair. She wasn't just playing a game. She was thirsty for validation, for proof that she could be the one to take control, to take what had always been denied to her. She knew how to push Dominic's buttons, how to make him feel special, desired. She would listen to his frustrations, his dreams, his disappointments. She understood him in ways Cassandra never could. And when she whispered words of encouragement in his ear, telling him he was worth more than the life he had, Dominic began to believe her. But what neither of them could see was how quickly everything was escalating. They were playing a dangerous game, one that would eventually come crashing down on them. They began to meet more frequently, becoming more brazen with their stolen moments. The risk only seemed to fuel their passion. For Jessica, it was intoxicating. She reveled in the secrecy, in the thrill of having something that Cassandra didn't. The affair was her victory, a reminder that she could still win, that she could still take control of her life. She could no longer stand in the shadows of her sister's perfect life. If she couldn't have Dominic's heart, at least she would have his body. But with each stolen kiss, with each secret meeting, the consequences grew more inevitable. Dominic was already feeling the weight of his choices. The guilt gnawed at him, but it was always tempered by the excitement, the need to be wanted, to be seen in a way that felt real. He couldn't see how this would end, he just knew that, for the first time in years, he felt alive. The lies they told themselves, telling each other it was just a fling, that it was just a way to break free from the constraints of their lives, only served to entangle them further. The more they deceived themselves, the deeper they sank into a web they would never be able to escape. And in the back of their minds, they both knew it wouldn't be long before Cassandra found out. It was inevitable. The days that followed the start of Dominic and Jessica's secret affair felt like they were being pulled deeper into a storm they had no control over. The once clear lines of right and wrong had blurred, and neither of them could see a way out. What began as a subtle, seemingly innocent attraction had escalated into something far darker, an emotional and physical entanglement that neither could deny. For Dominic, the guilt was suffocating. He had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, a husband who would never betray the woman he had promised to love and cherish. Yet here he was, caught in an affair with his wife's sister, a woman he had once seen as nothing more than family. The weight of his choices bore down on him, and each passing day felt like another step toward inevitable destruction. He loved Cassandra, or at least he had, but he had to admit to himself that the connection they once shared had started to wither. Over time, the small things had added up, the endless routine, the lack of spontaneity, the absence of passion. And then there was Jessica, whose presence in his life reignited something he had long buried, the sense of excitement, the wild freedom he had lost. Jessica understood him in ways that Cassandra no longer could. She didn't demand perfection from him. She didn't look at him with the same expectations that made him feel trapped. She listened to him in a way that Cassandra hadn't in years, offering him validation and empathy that he had craved. But with every stolen moment, the guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the life he was destroying. He would come home to Cassandra, who still loved him, who still saw the man he had once been, but all he could think about was Jessica. The way she made him feel alive. The way she made him feel like he mattered. The lies were beginning to eat away at him. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the man he was becoming. He had always been the stable, reliable husband, the architect with a vision for the future. But now, he was torn between two worlds, the life he had built with Cassandra and the temptation that Jessica represented. Each encounter with Jessica felt like a step further down a path that he could never return from. He had betrayed his vows, and with every stolen kiss, every secret meeting, he felt a piece of himself slipping away. For Jessica, the consequences were different. She had never been someone who backed down from what she wanted. But the more she got involved with Dominic, the more complicated things became. She had come back to Hampton Falls seeking attention, seeking validation that she was worthy of love and admiration, but somewhere along the way, she had become entangled in something that was much bigger than herself. She wasn't just playing a game anymore. She was emotionally invested, and the reality of what she had done was starting to set in. At first, it had been exhilarating, the thrill of the forbidden, the rush of stealing something that was never meant to be hers. She told herself it was all about proving to herself that she could win, that she could have something Cassandra didn't. She had always lived in her sister's shadow, always felt like the rebellious, misunderstood younger sister. But now, with Dominic's attention, she felt seen, felt powerful in a way she hadn't before. The affair had become more than just a fleeting distraction, it had become a way for her to feel important, to feel like she mattered. But the weight of her actions was beginning to take its toll. Jessica wasn't a stranger to guilt, she had carried it with her for years, ever since she had left Hampton Falls all those years ago. But now, it was different. She wasn't just betraying her sister's trust, she was betraying herself. She could see how Dominic's internal conflict was slowly eating away at him, and she couldn't help but feel responsible for the chaos they were causing. The worst part was that, despite everything, she couldn't stop. Every time she thought about pulling away, about ending the affair and letting Dominic return to his marriage, she couldn't do it. There was too much desire, too much longing. It wasn't just about the physical attraction anymore, it was about the emotional connection they had forged. Dominic was her escape, her way out of the life she had always felt trapped in. She told herself that it wasn't real, that it was just a moment of passion, that she was simply taking what life had denied her for so long. But the truth was much messier than that. She was as lost as Dominic was, caught in a web of their own making. For both of them, the affair had become an addiction, a desperate attempt to fill the voids in their lives. But neither of them could see the consequences of their actions until it was too late. They were in too deep to turn back now. Jessica began to sense that Dominic was struggling, that his guilt was starting to weigh on him. She could see the way he would pull away from her at times, as if wrestling with his conscience. He would retreat into himself, his eyes distant, lost in thought. And she could feel it, the subtle shift in his behavior, the growing distance between them. It wasn't just his marriage that was falling apart, it was his very sense of self. He was losing himself, piece by piece, and Jessica was helpless to stop it. For Jessica, the stakes had always been high, but now they felt even higher. She had wanted to prove something, to herself, to her family, to the world. But she had never intended for things to spiral this far out of control. The lines between right and wrong had blurred so much that she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. She wasn't sure who she was anymore, or what she truly wanted. She had set out to take what was never meant to be hers, but now she was trapped in a situation that seemed impossible to escape. Meanwhile, Cassandra, oblivious to the betrayal unfolding right under her nose, remained in the dark, trying to fix a marriage that was slipping through her fingers. She had no idea that the man she had given her heart to, the man who had once been her partner in everything, was slipping away from her. The facade of their perfect life was crumbling, but Cassandra hadn't seen the cracks, hadn't heard the whispers in the shadows. The storm was coming, and none of them knew how devastating the consequences would be when the truth finally came to light. Dominic and Jessica were both drowning in their own lies, and sooner or later, the weight of their actions would be too much to bear. The days in Hampton Falls had grown colder as winter approached, but it wasn't just the change in the weather that chilled Cassandra. It was the creeping sense of unease that had begun to settle in her chest. For weeks now, she had noticed small things, insignificant, she had told herself at first, that seemed to speak louder than words. It was the way Dominic had become distant, how his smiles no longer reached his eyes, how his quiet absences at home stretched longer and longer. But it was more than that. It was the strange feeling that something was wrong, something that had been out of place for far too long. At first, she had pushed the thoughts away. She was a woman who valued stability, who preferred calm over chaos. She had built her life with Dominic on the foundation of trust and mutual respect. But as the days went by, the cracks in their marriage became impossible to ignore. The long hours Dominic spent at work, the sudden need for more business trips, the way he would sometimes look at her with a distant, almost apologetic gaze, it was all starting to add up. It wasn't just that Dominic had been acting different. No, it was the strange feeling that someone else was occupying a space in their life, in their home. Cassandra had always been intuitive, a woman who prided herself on reading people. But now, every time she looked at Dominic, she felt like a stranger was standing in front of her. It was as though he was hiding something from her, something important, and it was eating away at her. The final straw came one afternoon when Cassandra was tidying up their bedroom. She had gone to Dominic's jacket pocket to retrieve his keys, only to find a small, elegant matchbook from a hotel in Portsmouth, a place she knew had no connection to Dominic's usual business trips. Her heart stopped, and for a moment, she felt like the world was slipping out from under her feet. She opened the matchbook carefully, as though the slightest movement might shatter the fragile calm that had existed in their home for so many years. The logo of a hotel she didn't recognize stared back at her, and a deep sense of dread washed over her. This was no mistake. Dominic had been hiding something from her, and whatever it wasn't good. The pit in her stomach grew larger as she imagined the possibilities, each one more painful than the last. Cassandra knew she could no longer ignore what her instincts were telling her. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The small, nagging whispers in her mind had turned into a deafening roar. What had been a quiet, unresolved fear was now undeniable. The woman she had once trusted, the man she had built a life with, had betrayed her, and there was no way around it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Cassandra felt a cold determination take hold of her. She would confront Dominic. She couldn't live in the dark anymore, couldn't allow herself to pretend that everything was fine when she knew it wasn't. The years of devotion, the promises, the love they had shared, it all felt like a distant memory now, overshadowed by the uncertainty and pain she was about to face. When Dominic walked through the door that evening, he was immediately met with Cassandra's quiet but resolute gaze. She had always been the calm, collected one, but tonight was different. Tonight, the storm was within her, and it was just waiting to break free. Dominic, sensing the change in the air, froze for a moment. He knew something was off. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut through with a knife. "Cassandra?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. "I found this," she said, her voice steady but cold, holding up the matchbook for him to see. "A hotel in Portsmouth. Care to explain?" Dominic's face paled, his eyes flickering with panic for just a split second before he masked it with a feeble attempt at a smile. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice wavering slightly. Cassandra took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. The words she had been holding in for weeks, months even, were now bubbling to the surface, demanding to be spoken. "Then what is it, Dominic? Because I'm not an idiot. I know when something's wrong. I've known for weeks. But this is different." Her voice trembled with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "How could you? After everything? After all we've built?" Dominic stood there, speechless for a moment, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. His mouth opened and closed, as though he were searching for the right words, but no words could make this right. He had betrayed her. There was no hiding from it now. No more excuses. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and he sighed, his voice filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Cassandra. I never meant for this to happen." Her heart shattered at his words, but it wasn't the apology she had hoped for. It wasn't enough. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "A few months," he admitted, his voice strained. A silence fell between them. Cassandra's mind raced as the reality of his confession sank in. A few months. The weight of those words crushed her. Her mind flashed to the last several months, the quiet dinners, the lonely nights, the distance that had grown between them. She had thought it was just the pressures of life, of work, of time. But now she understood. It had never been about time. It had been about something much deeper, something that had been brewing between them, festering quietly, until it exploded into this. Into betrayal. "You slept with her," Cassandra said, her voice filled with disbelief. She couldn't even bring herself to say Jessica's name. It felt wrong, unnatural. "My sister, you slept with her?" Dominic's silence was all the answer she needed. She could see it in his eyes, the shame, the guilt, the resignation. The truth was out, and there was no way to undo what had been done. A wave of emotion surged through Cassandra, anger, heartbreak, betrayal, but beneath it all, there was a quiet, gnawing sense of loss. She had lost her husband, the man she thought she knew, the man who had promised her forever. And she had lost her sister, the one person who should have been on her side, the one person who should have protected her. She turned away from him, her chest tight with emotion, and walked toward the window, looking out at the darkening sky. Her mind was racing, but her heart felt numb. "You've destroyed everything," she said, her voice barely audible. "And for what?" "For what, Dominic?" He didn't answer. Cassandra didn't know what came next. She didn't know if they could come back from this. But one thing was certain, their perfect life, the one they had built together, was gone. And nothing, not even Dominic's apology, could bring it back. The evening stretched on in Hampton Falls, as a storm rumbled in from the sea, its thunder rolling across the darkened sky. Inside the Dawson home, the tension was palpable, thicker than the fog that had begun to roll in off the coast. Cassandra stood by the window, her mind in turmoil, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth that had just been revealed to her. The revelation of her husband's affair with her sister was more than a betrayal, it was the destruction of everything she had built. Every foundation she thought was solid had crumbled under the force of this single moment, and she was left standing in the ruins, grasping for answers. Dominic stood a few feet away, his posture slumped, as though the weight of his guilt had become too much to bear. His face was pale, his eyes dull with remorse. He had broken the one thing that mattered most to him, his marriage, and now, there was nothing he could do to fix it. His attempts at explaining, at apologizing, had fallen flat. He knew that no words could undo the damage, no actions could take back the hurt. But there was something else in the air that evening, something even more intense than the storm brewing outside. A sense of finality, as if the hourglass had run out of sand, and the inevitable was about to happen. Cassandra turned toward him, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and anguish. "How long?" she repeated, her voice cold and hard now, no longer pleading for an answer. "How long has this been going on, Dominic? And don't lie to me anymore. Don't try to make excuses." Dominic's gaze faltered, his eyes avoiding hers. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. There was nothing left to say. No more lies he could tell. No more justifications he could offer. He had betrayed her. He had broken her trust, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. Cassandra's fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. "How could you do this?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. The anger that had been building inside her now bubbled to the surface. "With her, Dominic? My sister? You were supposed to be the man who stood by me. The man I trusted. You promised me forever. How could you throw that all away?" Dominic's breath hitched as he looked at her, his expression filled with regret. I never meant for this to happen, Cassandra. It was a mistake. I don't know how it got this far. I was weak, and I made terrible choices. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. His apology sounded hollow to Cassandra now. She could hear the emptiness in his voice, and it made her sick. She had spent years believing in him, believing in their love, in their perfect life. And now it was all a lie. The perfect marriage she had built in her mind had been nothing more than a fragile house of cards, easily swept away by a few misplaced decisions. You destroyed everything, she whispered, her voice low, almost to herself. You destroyed our marriage. Our family. For what? For a fleeting moment of excitement? For her? Dominic stood there, silent. What could he say? What could he do to take back the devastation he had caused? The look in Cassandra's eyes told him everything he needed to know. He had broken her, and there was no coming back from it. Then, the front door creaked open, and the sound of footsteps entering the house broke through the suffocating silence. It was Jessica. She had been there all along, hiding in the wings, waiting for the confrontation she knew was inevitable. Cassandra's heart sank as Jessica stepped into the room, her eyes meeting hers with an expression that could only be described as defiant, even somewhat pleased. There was no remorse in her gaze, no trace of guilt. Instead, it was as if she were reveling in the chaos she had created, the damage she had caused. "You're here," Cassandra said, her voice sharp as a knife. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think I wouldn't see it? You, of all people. My sister." Jessica gave a small, almost amused smile, as though Cassandra's anger was some kind of game to her. "I didn't want to hurt you, Cassandra. You know that, right? But it happened, and I didn't plan it. But once it started, it was like nothing else mattered. Dominic and we have something real." The words hit Cassandra like a physical blow. Something inside her snapped, and for the first time, she felt a surge of raw, unfiltered rage flood through her. "You destroyed my life," she screamed, her voice breaking. "Both of you. For what? For this? For this sick, twisted thing you've created between you two? I gave you everything, Jessica. I gave you my love, my trust. And you stabbed me in the back. I never saw it coming. I never saw it coming." Dominic flinched, his hand reaching out as if to comfort her, but Cassandra recoiled from him, as though his touch burned her. "You're not my husband anymore," she spat, her words dripping with venom. "And you," she turned to Jessica, her eyes burning with fury, "you're not my sister. I don't know who you are anymore. But you've ruined everything." The storm outside seemed to intensify as Cassandra spoke, the winds howling against the windows. The house, once a symbol of their life together, now felt like a cage, a prison that held them all within its walls, unable to escape the consequences of their actions. For a moment, there was silence. No one spoke, no one moved. The weight of the confrontation hung heavy in the room. Cassandra's heart ached, but it was a different kind of ache now, a deep, bone-crushing grief that settled in her chest. The love she had once known, the family she had worked so hard to protect, was gone. Her marriage to Dominic had been shattered, and with it, her trust in everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and family. Finally, Dominic stepped forward, his voice shaky. "Cassandra, please. I love you. I never wanted this. But Cassandra held up her hand, silencing him. "No, Dominic. No more lies." Her voice was firm now, unwavering. "You don't get to ask for my forgiveness. You don't get to make this right." Jessica watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, no one moved. The storm raged on outside, and inside, the pieces of their lives lay shattered on the floor. And then, as if in slow motion, Cassandra made a decision. "I want you to leave. Both of you," she said, her voice cold, devoid of emotion. "I never want to see either of you again." With that, the door closed behind them, Jessica and Dominic, the two people who had betrayed her. And Cassandra stood alone in the house that had once been filled with love, now haunted by the ghosts of what was lost. The aftermath of Cassandra's discovery was a storm that raged in Hampton Falls, a town that, up until now, had always prided itself on its tranquility. Whispers spread like wildfire through the town's narrow streets, through the tight-knit community that had known the Dawson family for generations. What had once been a perfect, enviable marriage had crumbled under the weight of betrayal, and everyone was talking. The scandal was impossible to ignore. But while the townspeople were gossiping and speculating, the truth was just beginning to surface, and it was far from over. It was a cold December morning when Detective Sarah Watson arrived in Hampton Falls. The seasoned investigator from a nearby city had been called in to investigate the mysterious circumstances surrounding Cassandra's death. The town had always been quiet, its peace rarely disturbed by anything more sinister than a petty theft. But this was different. The tragic car accident that had claimed Cassandra's life was more than just a simple misfortune. Something didn't sit right with the case, and Detective Watson had a hunch that there was more to it than met the eye. Watson had heard the rumors, the whispers of a tragic love triangle, of a marriage destroyed by infidelity. But she had learned long ago not to rely on hearsay. She needed facts, evidence. And as she stood in the driveway of the Blakes' mansion, looking up at the large, elegant house, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Something about the whole situation didn't add up, and she intended to find out what it was. The first place Watson went was the Rusty Anchor, the local bar where Cassandra had been seen the night of her death. The bartender, Hank, was a reluctant but key witness. He was an older man, weathered by years of watching people stumble in and out of the bar, seeking solace in a drink. But when Detective Watson approached him, his usually gruff demeanor shifted. He had seen Cassandra that night, and he had seen the turmoil in her eyes. "I tried to stop her," Hank said, his voice thick with regret. "But she was determined. She'd been drinking heavily, crying most of the night. She said she didn't care about anything anymore, about Dominic, about Jessica, about her life." Hank's words painted a picture of a woman in emotional distress, not the type of woman who would drive herself into danger. She had been spiraling, consumed by the weight of her emotions, but she had never been reckless, until that night. Cassandra had seemed to lose all sense of caution, drowning her pain in alcohol, pushing away the last bit of control she had over her life. "That's when she asked for another drink," Hank continued, his eyes darting toward the door as if he didn't want anyone overhearing. "She wasn't herself. I knew something was off. I asked if she needed a ride home, but she refused. She just kept mumbling about how everything was falling apart and how she was done." It was a crucial piece of information. Detective Watson had heard enough to suspect that something had driven Cassandra to the brink, but what exactly had caused her to spiral so completely? As Watson moved forward with her investigation, she interviewed the people closest to Cassandra, the ones who had seen her in her final days. What she uncovered made the truth of Cassandra's turmoil even clearer. Many spoke of Cassandra's emotional withdrawal, of how she had become quieter and more distant in the weeks leading up to her death. She had stopped attending social gatherings, withdrawn from her friends, and had been spending more time at home, seemingly lost in thought. What struck Detective Watson most was a conversation she had with Olivia Chen, Cassandra's closest friend. Olivia had been hesitant to speak ill of the dead, but as Watson pressed, the truth began to surface. "Cassandra, she found out about the affair," Olivia revealed, her voice barely above a whisper. "She suspected it for a while, but she never confronted Dominic or Jessica. She didn't want to believe it. But she told me that night before everything happened. She said she knew what was going on. She said it was the worst kind of betrayal. Her own sister. Olivia's words hit Watson like a freight train. Cassandra had known about the affair. She had known, and yet she hadn't confronted it. Instead, she had carried the weight of the secret alone, allowing it to consume her until she broke. This new revelation gave Watson a clearer picture of the emotional trauma Cassandra had been experiencing, and perhaps a motive for what followed. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but Watson needed more. She needed proof, something concrete to connect the dots between the affair, Cassandra's growing emotional distress, and the tragic accident. It was at this point that Watson turned her attention back to Dominic and Jessica, the two people whose actions had ultimately led to Cassandra's breakdown. The couple's behavior in the days following Cassandra's death had been nothing short of suspicious. They had been seen together more often than was normal, offering each other comforting glances and whispered conversations that ceased whenever anyone approached. They weren't acting like people who had just lost a loved one, they were acting like partners in a crime. And Watson knew it was only a matter of time before she uncovered the full extent of their involvement. A breakthrough came when Watson reviewed the bank records for Dominic and Jessica's transactions. The timeline lined up perfectly with the period of the affair, and there were records of hotel bookings, gifts purchased at high-end stores, and mysterious payments that seemed to coincide with Dominic's claimed business trips. The damning evidence mounted, and Watson knew she had enough to bring them in for questioning. When Dominic and Jessica were brought in for separate interviews, their carefully constructed alibis quickly began to fall apart under Watson's relentless questioning. They both tried to deny their involvement, to claim it had been a lapse in judgment, but as Watson pressed further, their defenses crumbled. It was Jessica who cracked first. Yes, she confessed, tears streaming down her face. We were having an affair. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. And Cassandra, she found out. That night, there was a huge fight. All three of us were shouting at each other, and Cassandra left the house after. I didn't know what had happened to her. I swear, I didn't. Dominic's face was pale, his hands trembling as he admitted the truth, though he denied any direct involvement in Cassandra's death. We made a terrible mistake, he said, his voice hollow with regret. I loved Cassandra, I really did. I never wanted any of this to happen. As the investigation drew to a close, the evidence was undeniable. Cassandra had learned the truth about the affair, and the emotional fallout had driven her to the brink. Her distress over the betrayal had led to a breakdown, and in her state of emotional turmoil, she had tragically lost control of her car, driving off the road into the ravine. While no criminal charges could be filed directly for Cassandra's death, it was clear that the affair had set the tragic events in motion. Dominic and Jessica's betrayal had not only destroyed a marriage but had also driven Cassandra to her untimely demise. The guilt would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. Hampton Falls would never be the same again. The town, once a symbol of small-town peace, now carried the heavy weight of its own dark secrets. And for Dominic and Jessica, the consequences of their actions would follow them forever, no matter how much they tried to move on. The final chapter in the saga of Cassandra Dawson, Dominic Blake, and Jessica Dawson had been written, but the consequences of their actions lingered long after the truth had been revealed. Hampton Falls, once a town marked by its quiet charm, now bore the scars of its inhabitants' darkest secrets. The cracks that had appeared in the perfect life Cassandra had built could never be repaired. And though justice had been served in the form of the public exposure of Dominic and Jessica's affair, the emotional toll it had taken was irreversible. As the investigation concluded, Detective Sarah Watson filed her final report, noting that no criminal charges would be brought against Dominic and Jessica for Cassandra's death. The circumstances surrounding her tragic accident, driven by emotional turmoil and the aftermath of betrayal, were tragic enough. However, in the eyes of the town and the people who had known Cassandra, the verdict was already clear: Dominic and Jessica had caused her emotional demise. Their actions had led to the destruction of a woman who had been loved, a woman whose life had been stolen away by a lie too big to be ignored. Dominic, now left alone with the consequences of his choices, could not escape the suffocating weight of his guilt. In the weeks that followed the investigation, he withdrew from public life, retreating into his work, though it no longer brought him the satisfaction it once had. Every time he walked through the streets of Hampton Falls, he saw the eyes of those who knew him, eyes that had once looked at him with respect, now filled with judgment. He could not escape the whispers of the town, the judgment that would follow him for the rest of his life. He had betrayed Cassandra, and the consequences of that betrayal were not just personal, they were public, a stain on his character that could never be erased. Jessica, too, found herself in a different kind of prison. The thrill of her secret affair, once so exhilarating, had faded into regret and self-loathing. She had never expected it to go this far, never imagined that her desire for validation would result in such tragedy. The absence of her sister's presence in the house they had once shared, the absence of her family's trust, weighed heavily on her. Her conscience haunted her. She had betrayed not just Cassandra, but the sisterly bond they had once shared. The guilt gnawed at her, a constant reminder of the woman she had become. And in the quiet moments when she was alone, Jessica couldn't help but ask herself if it had all been worth it. Was the fleeting feeling of power, of being wanted, worth the destruction she had caused? As for Hampton Falls, the town moved on, as all towns do. The gossip slowed, the shock began to dissipate, but the impact remained. The community, which had once rallied around the Dawson family as a symbol of idealism, could never look at them the same way again. The perfect family had been torn apart, and the scars were visible to everyone who had ever known them. But the true tragedy was not in the affair itself, nor even in the accident that took Cassandra's life. The true tragedy lay in the loss of trust, the betrayal of two people who should have loved and protected her, the violation of the sacred bonds of marriage and sisterhood. Cassandra had given her all to both Dominic and Jessica, and in return, she had been crushed under the weight of their lies. The question that lingered, even as the story came to an end, was simple: was anything truly worth this kind of heartbreak? In the quiet aftermath, as Hampton Falls slowly returned to normal, the question that remained was whether anyone could ever move forward from such a betrayal. Dominic and Jessica, for all their remorse and regret, would carry the heavy burden of their actions for the rest of their lives. And for the community, there was no return to the innocence they had lost, no way to undo the damage done by the scandal. The moral of the story was clear: betrayal comes at a price, and sometimes, that price is far greater than we could ever imagine. It wasn't just the lives of those involved that were ruined, it was the lives of everyone who had loved them, everyone who had believed in their story. What do you think about this story? Do you think Dominic and Jessica truly regretted their actions, or was it just too little too late? How would you feel if you were Cassandra in this situation? Do you think there's a way back from such a betrayal, or is the damage permanent? Leave a comment below to share your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you think about this story, and what lessons you believe we can take from it. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping true crime stories, where we explore the complexities of relationships, betrayal, and justice. Hit the like button if you think loyalty is one of the most important things in a relationship, and don't forget to share this story with your friends. Who knows, maybe your thoughts will help others reflect on the deeper truths about trust and forgiveness.